Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to get philosophical?
Always.
Good, because today we're diving into some excerpts from a dialogue between, well, three pretty heavy hitters: J. Krishnamurti, David Bohm, and Dr. Parchure.
Ah, yes. Deep thinkers, all of them. Definitely not known for keeping things light. But that's what makes them so fascinating, right?
Right, their conversations were full of, well, how do I put it, incredibly insightful, even radical ideas about, like, the big stuff, thought, desire, truth, that kind of thing.
The really fundamental questions. And for anyone who might not be familiar, well, Krishnamurti was a philosopher and speaker, very renowned, who he really challenged how people thought about things.
And then Bohm, he was a leading quantum physicist,
Yeah,
so he brought that scientific lens to these philosophical discussions.
absolutely. And Dr. Parcher, well, he was a close associate of Krishnamurti, so he provided this really interesting perspective to help explore those ideas.
Yeah, and in this specific dialogue, they get into this idea. It's sort of unsettling, actually. How our thinking might actually be a little crooked.
Yes. They actually use this really vivid analogy. They compare thought to a corkscrew. You know how it always twists and turns?
Yeah.
It's a great way to picture how even when we're trying to create order, our thinking can actually lead us down a path of contradictions.
So even when we're trying to do the right thing, we might end up creating more disorder.
That's what they're saying. It's not that we're intentionally trying to mess things up, but our thinking, well, has this inherent tendency to twist and turn. It's not always going to lead us in a straight line.
Okay, so if our thinking is always twisting and turning like a corkscrew, like how can we ever make good decisions? How can we ever hope to really understand anything?
Right. That's a great question. It's kind of unsettling when you think about it, isn't it?
A little bit. It's like our minds are almost working against us, even if we have good intentions.
Exactly. It's this constant back and forth, like you solve one problem and bam, you've created two more.
So what's the solution? Do we just give up and say, well, my thinking's flawed, so I'm just going to do whatever?
No, not at all. It's not about becoming pessimistic. They aren't saying give up on thinking. It's more about understanding the inherent nature of thought, recognizing that it has these limitations.
So it's more about being aware of those limitations and trying to, I guess, work with them.
Precisely. It's about finding a balance. We can't just throw out thought altogether, right? We need it to function in the world,
Yeah.
but we can learn to use it more skillfully.
So, we can still use the corkscrew to open the wine bottle, but we need to be mindful of the twists and turns.
I like that. That's a great way to put it.
I do get stuck in overthinking loops sometimes, though, trying to find the perfect solution and just ending up more confused.
Absolutely. I think we all do that. That's actually a really good example of how this crookedness can play out in our lives. The more we try to force our thoughts into a perfect order, the more we end up getting tangled up.
So then what? If we can't rely on thinking to give us these clear-cut answers, how do we make decisions? How do we even, know what's true or real?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to their exploration of desire. See, they argue that desire is, in a way, an extension of thought.
Okay, that makes sense. We think about something we want, and that creates desire.
Right, exactly. And just like thought, desire is always shifting, latching onto one thing, then another, but never really finding lasting satisfaction.
Oh, that reminds me of this feeling I have sometimes, you get a new phone and then a newer model comes out and suddenly you want that one. It's like you can never be content with what you have.
A perfect example. And Krishnamurti uses some really relatable examples like desiring a house or a partner. The actual things we desire change, but that underlying feeling, the wanting never being satisfied, that just seems to stick around.
It's like the grass is always greener, right?
Exactly. We always think if we just get this one thing or achieve this one goal, then we'll finally be happy. That they're suggesting that that's a product of our crooked thinking.
So we're always chasing after something, thinking that will bring us happiness, but it never really does.
That's what they're getting at, yeah.
Okay, so this is a lot to take in. Our thinking is flawed, our desire is flawed. So where does that leave us? I mean, how are we supposed to find any happiness or fulfillment if everything's sort of, built on this shaky foundation?
That's where they get really radical. They start to question the nature of reality itself. They suggest that the reality we experience, the world we think we see and interact with, it might actually be an illusion.
Hold on. An illusion? Are they saying that nothing is real?
Not exactly. They're not denying the existence of the physical world, but they're saying that the way we perceive it, the meaning we give it, well, that's largely a product of our minds. And our minds, as we've been discussing, are shaped by our flawed thinking and desires.
So it's like our perception of reality is kind of like filtered through these lenses that might be, well, a little distorted.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. It's like looking at the world through glasses with a weird prescription. They use this interesting example. A microphone. They point out that even something as seemingly solid as a microphone, well, it's still a product of human thought, right? It exists because someone thought it up, designed it, manufactured it.
So even though the microphone exists in the world, it still wouldn't exist without human thought.
Exactly. And this leads them to question what parts of our reality, what we think of as real, might actually be more of a projection of our minds.
Oh, that's a lot.
It is.
So if our thinking is flawed and our perception of reality is shaped by that flawed thinking, are we basically just stuck? Like, can we ever see things clearly?
It's a big question, and it's one they tackle head on. We'll dive deeper into it next time, but for now, I think it's worth remembering that even though they point out all these limitations, they also acknowledge a basic human need for order, a need to understand the world and find our place in it.
Yeah, that makes sense. We can't just throw our hands up and say, oh, well, everything's an illusion, so nothing matters.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more interesting because they start to explore whether it's possible to achieve a kind of order that doesn't just lead to more disorder down the line.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. I guess we'll have to wait for part 2 to unravel that one.
We will. And we'll also start to delve into the very nature of truth itself.
Oh, boy, this is going to be good. Welcome back to the deep dive. So, where were we? Oh, right. Our minds are a bit messy, and reality might be, well, not what it seems.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, isn't it?
It is. I'm still trying to process all of that. But we left off on this question, like, if our thinking is so flawed, how do we even begin to create a better world? It's like, where do we even start?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And in this dialogue, they start to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the key isn't about trying to force order onto the world, but in understanding the nature of truth itself.
So instead of trying to fix everything, we need to understand what truth actually is. That seems even harder.
It might seem that way, but their approach is really interesting. It's less about like finding a definitive answer and more about shifting our perspective. They actually start to question whether truth, like in its purest form, can even exist within, the realm of our everyday thinking and perception.
Okay, I'm listening. What do they mean by that?
Well, they suggest that truth might be operating on a completely different level, almost like a foundation upon which our perceived reality rests. It's not something we can just grasp with our minds, but it's there, like influencing everything.
So it's like truth is this underlying current, and we're just like bobbing around on the surface, trying to make sense of the waves, but not really seeing the bigger picture.
That's a great analogy. It captures the essence of what they're getting at. They actually use this really powerful image of truth standing under reality, supporting it like the foundation of a house. We can see the house, the walls, all the details, but the foundation, that's hidden.
But if we can't see it, how do we know it's there? Like, how do we connect with this hidden truth?
Well, Krishnamurti, he describes these moments when the constant chatter of our thoughts just kind of stops. It could be when we're faced with something really beautiful, or even in a moment of danger.
I think I've felt that, like those moments where you're so present, all your worries and thoughts just kind of disappear.
Exactly. And they suggest that in those moments of stillness, when the corkscrew of thought stops twisting, well, we might actually catch a glimpse of a different kind of order, an order that's not something we create or impose, but it's just like inherent.
So it's less about trying to force things into order and more about like creating the space for this deeper order to kind of reveal itself.
That's what they're pointing towards. And they go on to say that the key to accessing this deeper order, well, it lies in cultivating a different kind of perception, one that goes beyond our usual way of thinking, one that's not limited by our conditioning.
Okay, so you've said different kind of perception a few times now. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that actually look like?
Sure. It's described as this kind of spontaneous, effortless seeing. It's not about forcing our minds to be quiet or anything like that. It's more about becoming aware of those moments when thought naturally subsides, when we can experience reality more directly.
So instead of constantly analyzing and trying to figure things out, we need to practice, like simply observing, just being present in the moment.
That's a big part of it. And they emphasize that this kind of perception, it's not something we can force or control. It's more like a grace, a gift. It just sort of arises when we create the right conditions.
This is making me think about when I'm out in nature, like hiking in the woods or something. I
Yeah.
feel like I'm more present, more aware in those moments.
That's a great example. Spending time in nature, doing something creative, even just paying attention to our breath. All those things can help create the space for this different kind of perception to emerge.
But isn't there a danger in relying on those moments of insight? Like, don't we still need our minds to, make decisions and figure things out in our daily lives? We can't just walk around in a constant state of bliss, right?
Of course not. They're not advocating for a complete rejection of thought. It's more about recognizing that thought is a tool. It's useful, but it's not the only tool. And it's definitely not the ultimate source of wisdom or truth.
So it's like finding a balance between the analytical mind and this more intuitive, perceptive way of seeing.
Exactly. It's about integration, not separation.
This is really challenging me to think differently. But I got to be honest, I'm still a bit skeptical. If our thinking is flawed and this deeper perception is so, well, elusive, how can we trust that it's leading us towards truth?
That's a valid question. And they address it by talking about the difference between, let's say, perception that's rooted in thought and perception that arises from a deeper level of awareness. Perception driven by thought, well, it's always filtered through our beliefs, biases, all that stuff. It's like looking at the world through colored glasses.
Okay, I can see how that would distort things.
Right. But this other kind of perception, they argue, is more like unfiltered. It's unbiased. It's more aligned with truth itself.
So it's like we're tapping into a universal wisdom that's always there, but we don't always see it because our own thoughts are in the way.
Exactly. And they suggest that this deeper perception, this unconditioned awareness, well, it's the key to not just understanding truth, but also to creating a better world.
Okay, that's a big claim. How does that actually work? Like, how does shifting our perception lead to a better world?
Well, that's what we'll explore in part 3. We'll dive into how this different way of seeing can play out in our everyday lives and how it might just lead to some pretty radical shifts in, well, everything, from our relationships to the way we address global challenges.
Welcome back to the deep dive. My head is spinning after all this talk about crooked thinking and hidden truths.
It's all to unpack, isn't it?
It really is. But so far, it's all been pretty theoretical. I'm still wondering, like, how does this different kind of perception actually work in the real world? How does it help us, deal with everyday stuff like relationships or social issues?
That's a great question. And to be honest, they don't really give a step-by-step guide, but they do offer some really interesting insights. Like, think about how we usually approach conflict.
Okay.
Our first instinct is usually to defend our position right, to analyze, strategize like we're trying to win an argument.
Oh, yeah. I'm totally guilty of that. My mind goes into overdrive trying to come up with the best argument, the best comeback.
Exactly. But what if instead of that analytical mindset, what if we just paused? Like really observe the situation, the emotions, the thoughts, both in ourselves and the other person.
You mean like just see things clearly without judgment?
Exactly. It sounds simple, but it's actually incredible. It takes practice. But that's what they're suggesting. By cultivating this mindfulness, this awareness, well, we train ourselves to access this different kind of perception.
Yeah.
It becomes easier to see things clearly, even in tough situations.
So it's more about gradually shifting our habits, not like suddenly becoming enlightened overnight.
Right. It's a process. And this shift, well, it can really change how we relate to ourselves and others. Imagine approaching a conversation not from a place of, I'm right and you're wrong, but from a place of genuinely wanting to understand the other person's point of view.
That would take a lot of humility, wouldn't it? Letting go of the egos need to be right all the time.
It does. But they argue that it leads to much deeper connections, more trust, and more compassion.
Yeah.
Even in conflict.
Okay, I can see how that would work in personal relationships. But what about, the bigger picture, like social injustice, climate change, these huge problems we're facing? Can this kind of perception really make a difference on that scale?
That's where it gets even more interesting. They suggest that those big problems, those societal issues, well, they're often a reflection of our collective consciousness, our shared patterns of thinking and perceiving.
So if we want to change the world, we need to change our minds first.
It's not quite that simple, but that's the general idea. By individually working on cultivating a more, let's say, clear and compassionate way of seeing, well, we contribute to a collective shift. And that shift, well, that's where real change comes from.
So it's like a ripple effect. Each individual act of awareness creates these ripples that can ultimately change the whole.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's not about imposing our will on the world. It's about aligning ourselves with a deeper understanding.
Like that idea we talked about before about order coming from within, not from some external force.
Exactly. True order, lasting peace, well-being, all of that, they argue, it can only emerge from this collective shift in consciousness, a movement away from fear, greed, separation.
This is all very inspiring, but also a bit daunting. Like, it's great to think we can create a better world by changing how we see things, but that's a huge task.
It is. It's a lifelong journey, and there's no magic formula. But even small shifts in awareness can make a difference.
This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. I feel like I have a new understanding of, well, my own responsibility, like how my own thoughts and perceptions, they really do matter.
And hopefully a sense of hope that by cultivating this awareness, we can create a more just, more compassionate, more harmonious world.
This has been an incredible journey. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the minds of Krishnamurti, Bohm, and Dr. Parchure. It's been a wild ride.